One of the most important things in color grading is knowing where to put your adjustments in your signal chain or your node tree, as this can literally make or break your grade. When I share my system with my students, they are almost always blown away by how easy this decision becomes. So in this video, I will share my exact system with you so you can stop the guesswork for good and save tons of time and finally start color grading with confidence. On the left here, we have our video file just as is. We can call this our input. And on the right side here, we have our output. This is our desired image. In between, we can do all kinds of adjustments, but to figure out exactly where they should be relative to each other, I came up with 3 core concepts we have to consider in order to make this decision super simple. The first concept deals with how clean your video signal is. Think about it. The more adjustments we add, the more we alter our image. So, for example, if I add an exposure and a balance adjustment, my image here will be altered by the exposure and the balance adjustment. Whereas right at the start here, the image is just as is, as we received it from the camera. Therefore, I call this concept signal integrity, and we can represent this with this triangle. As you can see, the signal is its cleanest at the input, and the more and more we alter the signal, the less pure the signal becomes. Let's move our exposure and balance adjustments on the side for now. The most obvious and extreme example would be film grain and noise reduction. In order to perform proper noise reduction, you need the cleanest signal possible. Therefore, your noise reduction should go at the very start, whereas film grain should come later in your node tree or signal chain. If I now apply the noise reduction after the film grain, the noise reduction algorithm has absolutely no chance to understand what's actual camera noise and what's film grain. Of course, this example is quite obvious, but the devil is in the detail and we will get there soon. The next concept is concerned with how close our adjustments are to the actual source file. This means the closer we put an adjustment to the input, the more it will behave as if the scene actually had these characteristics. Don't worry, I say this again. The closer we have an adjustment at the input, the more it will behave as if we were filming the scene with these actual characteristics. I know this is kind of hard to wrap your head around this, so let's put everything aside and have a look at an example. On this shot, I have only a simple color space transformation to our output color space, which is Rec. 709, and a simple exposure and contrast adjustment. Again, our input is on the left here and our output is on the right. Now, let's say we want to make the foreground a bit brighter. We do this by using a mask or a power window. But before we can do this, where should we put our adjustment? The workflow I'm seeing in most YouTube tutorials is that any selective adjustments, like masks or qualifiers, should be made later in your signal chain or node tree. So then, following common advice, I will put my shape light adjustments after the exposure and contrast adjustment just before my output color space transformation. Then let's move everything a bit up here. I will configure my actual mask to select the foreground, and then I will use my color wheels to make things a bit brighter. So I think we might get away with only a gamma adjustment. So let's try this. I just make everything a bit brighter, and I think somewhere around here looks decent. Now, since we're dealing with a concept that deals with the question how far this adjustment is from our original file, what happens if I drag this adjustment before our exposure and contrast adjustment? Well, let's get rid of the color wheels, then we bring everything back down and let's try it. So this is the image just as it looks right now, and now I swap the order of these 2 operations around. And look at that, the image looks vastly different. Again, this is before with our exposure adjustment first and the light adjustment after. And again, this is the other way around with our light adjustment before the exposure adjustment. You can see the resulting image is vastly different. Now, here's my point. If we adjust exposure during color grading, we mean to affect the entire image. If we shape the actual light of the scene after our exposure adjustment, we are taking the exposure adjustment into account. But if we think about this for a second longer, this doesn't make any sense, because exposure is a trait of the camera, whereas the actual ratio of the light, so the actual contrast ratio of the scene, is a trait of the scene. Okay, but what the hell does this mean? Again, we put everything on the side and start over one last time. We have this scene, and the plane is in the hangar, and the light is coming through this open gate right here. With our exposure adjustment in color grading, we decide how the camera sees the scene. However, with our lighting adjustment, we actually change the ratio of the light in the scene. So this is more as if we had an actual light on set to fill in the foreground. As a result, this fill light would compensate for the high contrast in the scene. This means we're changing an actual trait of the scene. Therefore, it makes sense to put our lighting adjustment before the exposure adjustment. And since this concept is concerned with how far away adjustments are from the actual scene, I call this concept scene proximity. Again, we can represent this with a triangle as well. Scene proximity is at its greatest at the input, because we are literally the closest as we can be at our scene. And the further we move away from our source file, well, the further we move away. Therefore, we are not really close to the actual scene. Now, if we think about this more critically, does this mean that even adjustments like skin tone correction should be done early in the signal chain as well? No, think about it this way. What we are seeing on our screen right now is the image that the camera produced when filming this scene. How skin tones are rendered is a trait of the camera and not a trait of the scene itself. Therefore, we can perform our skin tone adjustments later in the signal chain. To simplify this concept of scene proximity, let's get rid of our skin tones adjustment and place the input at the left and the output on the right. You want to divide your node tree or your signal chain into 3 major parts: traits of the scene, traits of the camera, and traits of the look. Traits of the scenes are adjustments like lighting adjustments using masks or power windows. Traits of the camera are adjustments like balance and exposure, and traits of the look would be something like how the skin tones are rendered, or adjustments that are concerned with color and saturation. Our goal is to achieve an image that looks the way we want it to look. The third concept is mainly concerned with the workflow point of view. For example, I know that I want to use a certain look for a given project, then I would choose or develop this look first, so I can apply it to the entire timeline. Having the look in place brings me so much closer to my final result already. I call this concept creative actualization, because this is the overarching goal that should influence all of our decisions along the way. There is no point in adjusting exposure if I don't know how my image looks with the actual look applied, because I don't know how the footage will react to the look in combination with my exposure adjustment. And this is the key point. I want to judge my image with the final look already in place, or at least as close as possible, because there is really no point in adjusting an image if I don't know how it will translate to the look. Since the workflow and the concept of creative actualization is very important, I already made a dedicated video on that. The link is in the video description. To reiterate, our signal flows from left to right, from input to output. Signal integrity is concerned with the purity of the signal. The video signal is its purest right at the input, and the more adjustments we add along the way, the less and less pure it becomes. Scene proximity divides our signal chain into 3 major chunks. Remember, traits of the scene, traits of the camera, and traits of the look. Emerging from the 2 aforementioned concepts is creative actualization, which dictates our workflow. As you can see, these concepts go hand in hand and cannot be considered independent of each other. Lastly, I'd like to give you a blueprint which you can adapt to your needs, but just handing out a blueprint would defy the purpose of this video, since I want you to think systematically using these concepts instead of just blindly following yet another blueprint that likely won't get you anywhere. And also, since everything is a bit different in Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, and Final Cut Pro, by the end of this video, I will show you exactly how you can implement what I'm about to show you in each and every NLE of your choice. So then, for one final time, let's get rid of the concepts. And I have my input on the left and my output on the right. In order to give you this blueprint, here are a couple of adjustments I do on pretty much every project. So then, let's randomly pick one and build a signal chain as we go. Skin tones adjustments. We just learned that skin tones adjustments are rather a trait of the look than anything else, so we can safely say that they come more towards the end of our signal chain or node tree. Also, we already talked about shaping the light, so this should go at the very beginning of our signal chain. Again, why does this go at the very beginning of our signal chain? Because we're changing the actual traits of the scene and nothing else. So we want to be as close as we can get to our video file. Next, let's approach this a bit more systematically. So what else do we have? IC and output device transformation, which is just a fancy word for a color space transformation from your working color space to your display color space. So for example, if you're working in DaVinci Resolve, this would be from DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate to Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4. Let's put this at the very end. Also down here I can spot an IDT, which is another fancy word for an input device transformation, which goes from your camera color space to your working color space. So for example, you're shooting with a Sony camera, you shoot in S-Log3, S-Gamma3.Cine, and you are working in DaVinci Resolve. So then you want to go from S-Log3, S-Gamma3.Cine to DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, and this should go at the very beginning of this signal chain, because this literally decides how we process our operations in between. Next, let's place our exposure adjustment. So exposure and contrast can go right here. And what if you want to balance your image, meaning removing any color casts or just balancing it to fit the mood a bit better? Well, this is a point where people have different opinions and it really doesn't matter too much. So I, Eric, personally like to adjust my exposure and contrast first before I do any balancing work. So I usually put my balance adjustment after the exposure and contrast adjustment. Because the thing you have to keep in mind, if you balance your image using your color wheels or your primaries or the temperature and tint slider, all of these operations are luminance preserving. So no matter how far you push your white balance, DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro or Premiere Pro will always try to compensate with the other channels to keep the same level of, let's call it, brightness for the sake of this video. But what if you're shooting raw footage? So this does not apply to log footage, this only applies to raw footage. This is why I have white balance, in brackets raw, as an extra item here. So with raw footage, it is a bit different, because changing the white balance in a raw panel will most likely be not luminance preserving. Meaning, if you change the white balance in the raw panel, you will have shifts in the actual brightness of your scene. So therefore, if you're working with raw footage, I would place this just before the exposure and contrast adjustment right here. But still, we're adjusting the traits of the camera with these three adjustments, so we can still consider this as one group, traits of the camera. To save some space, I get rid of the raw adjustment, but keep that in mind. Next, here's a tricky one. What if you want to change the temperature or the tint of your light sources in your scene using any masks or power windows? So then, changing the temperature of the light sources in our scene, I would say we're changing the characteristics or the traits of the actual scene. So therefore, I would put this right here after we shape our light. Because again, we're changing the traits of the scene. I just have to put them vertically now because I'm running out of space. Here is another tricky one. What if we want to use something like a mask or a power window to brighten or darken facial features, or make the face or the subject entirely a bit brighter? I would also say this counts as changing the traits of the scene. Because remember, in the scene where the plane was in the hangar, with our lighting adjustment, we emulated the effect as if we had an actual fill light on set. So if you brighten a subject, or if you brighten the face or certain facial features, I think this still counts as a trait of the scene. Because if you had a good grip on set, they would have done it on set. So I would consider this as an adjustment of the scene. Therefore, I will put it right at the beginning of my signal chain or node tree here. Now, to save some space, let's move them down, because both of these adjustments can be grouped with the term shape light. If we change the temperature or the tint, we shape our light source, or if we brighten or darken facial features or anything else, then we're shaping the light as well. Next, let's think about noise reduction. Do we change the traits of the scene? No. Do we change the traits of the camera? Yes, because the camera creates the noise in the first place. Noise in your image signal is just how your camera sees the world. However, what if we take the concept of signal integrity into account? Then suddenly we realize, okay, noise reduction. Noise reduction doesn't know or care about our lighting adjustments that we did. The noise reduction algorithm generally needs the cleanest image possible. So therefore, our concept of scene proximity gets overruled by the concept of signal integrity. I will move my adjustments down and slide noise reduction in right at the beginning here. Next, let's have a look at adjusting the overall saturation of your clip. So this is another adjustment where it's pretty much up to your taste. Some people like to perform saturation adjustments alongside their balance adjustments, but some people like to do this later on in their signal chain. Really, there is nothing right or wrong here, because you can argue that saturation is rather a trait of your look than it is a trait of your camera, or you can make the case that your camera didn't see the world correctly and the colors were more vivid, so then it would count as a balance adjustment. So it could go either here as a trait of the camera or later on as a trait of the look. So I will just leave this down here because it's really up to you. It's either a trait of the camera or a trait of the look. Now let's tackle any other secondary HSL adjustments, and I would always consider them as a trait of the look. Because going into your image so granularly means that you're overruling how your camera saw the world. Therefore, I would not say this is a trait of the camera, nor is it a trait of the scene. This is rather a trait of the look. And I would think we can put this right here in this category. And the order of operations here is really interchangeable. Next, here's a spicy one. What if you would like to sharpen your image? Sharpening is, in the context of scene proximity, rather a trait of the camera than anything else. However, you can also make the case that sharpening your image could be a trait of the look, because maybe you know that you want to achieve a more crisp and a more crunchy look, then this would be a trait of the look, and maybe you can do it on your look adjustment over your entire timeline. So again, this is one where it's really up to you. I know some colorists that say all of the texture stuff is what I do last, therefore sharpen, grain, anything like that goes last, and they consider it as a part of their look. I would say yes, sharpening is a trait of the look. However, if you're mixing and matching cameras and you have one camera that is a bit softer than the other cameras you're using for your project, then I would say this is rather a trait of the camera, because you're compensating for the lack of sharpness of one individual camera, and then I would put it here. But generally speaking, using the same camera or comparably sharp or crisp cameras in one project, I would consider this a trait of the look. Last but not least, we have the major four: halation, a global vignette, some film grain, and bloom. All the spicy stuff you need for a good film emulation. So, halation. You could say, okay, halation is happening in a film camera. So it would happen inside the camera, therefore this is how the camera sees the world, therefore it's an adjustment of the traits of the camera. I would say yes, but also no, because this is where the concept of creative actualization comes into play. Yes, you're absolutely right, this is a trait of the camera. However, creative actualization tells us that we do all of the major adjustments that will affect our entire project in one go at the look development level. Therefore, all of these 4 adjustments, because it really counts for everything. Bloom is a trait of the camera lens, so you could argue that it should go somewhere here. But again, the concept of creative actualization tells us that all of these should be considered as look adjustments. Because giving our entire project a film look puts everything under one creative intent. So we can say everything is under the umbrella of look development. Also, we may count sharpening to that. So let's restore the order over there. Now let's leave look development aside for now. Let's have a look at just the plain node tree on the clip level. You have your source file, then you have an input color space transformation to your working color space if you're working in DaVinci Resolve. But if you're not working in DaVinci Resolve, if you're working in Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro, then there is nothing wrong with using no input color space transformation, because most camera color spaces are perfectly fine working color spaces as well. So yeah, now you know. Okay, input device transformation, the color space transformation into our actual working color space. Then I would reserve a spot for noise reduction, and you don't necessarily want to turn this on from the start, because having noise reduction on your footage really bogs down timeline performance and really bogs down the performance of your entire computer. So I would just put it at the start, leave it off for now, and then when you're ready to deal with noise reduction, meaning if you've done everything else, then I would turn it back on. So yeah, you just save yourself the hassle of your computer running steaming hot. Next, we have the traits of our camera. Usually exposure and balance. I like to do it in this order. You can also do it the other way around. It's really up to you. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that if you're working with RAW footage, the white balance for RAW footage should be done before your exposure adjustment, because this will definitely introduce some shifts in the brightness in your scene. Next, you have any kind of secondary adjustments like any HSL adjustments, saturation, skin tones, anything like that, and you can really order them just as you like. This is really up to your workflow, and there is nothing right or wrong there, but when in doubt, you now have 3 concepts that will help you to make this decision. Then the end of our signal chain is a bit deceiving, because on a clip level, we don't go to the actual output. We just cut it off here, and then everything goes away, and we move to the timeline level where we do our look development. From our look, we usually go to the output device transformation, which is the color space transformation to our target color space, like Rec. 709, and then we are at the output. Though I should note that some people like to do look development in Rec. 709. I'm not a huge fan of this, but whatever floats your boat, I guess. So this is also a valid approach. But when I work in Resolve, I usually like to do it the other way around, because pretty much all of the tools are color space aware anyway. So then let's move this aside. Why didn't I talk about the overarching umbrella of look development using anything like vignettes, sharpening, bloom, halation, film grain, anything like that? Because this is a very important realization to have, that look development is indeed not color grading. At least if you ask me. But this is a topic for another video, so that's coming soon. And if you want to know how to do all of this in your NLE of choice, be it DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro, Premiere Pro, or something else entirely, be sure to watch this video next.